Bienvenidos a todos a esta nueva sesión que tiene la especialidad de que aparece como patrocinada por el anuario que ya conocéis del IEMed y la revista Afkar, en la que muchos de vosotros pues habéis escrito y que esperamos que pues todos vosotros sigáis escribiendo o os incorporéis a ello progresivamente. Con lo cual, en fin, no los dejo aquí expuestos porque se caerían, pero tengo que hacer el recordatorio. Antes estábamos comentando con Anna Khakee, porque han dicho que se pronuncia Khakee. He intentado ver si era Khakee y no, es como el fruto, me ha dicho. Vale, pues aquí también lo llamamos palo santo. Muy bien. No, y hablábamos de que tanto el anuario como el IEMed, como Afkar son especialmente útiles porque está hecho con distinto estilo. Afkar, pues estilo un poco más periodístico, estilo un poco más corto, y el Mediterranean Yearbook pues es un estilo más académico, pero los dos, en distinta medida, razonablemente cortos. De tal manera que pues yo lo uso muchas veces porque hacemos una edición bastante extensa, aparte del acceso que hay totalmente abierto online, y que además cuando vamos recibiendo los artículos los vamos ya sacando durante el año y luego aparece finalmente la versión pues impresa. Seguimos haciendo el esfuerzo en hacer una gran distribución para hacer aterrizar el volumen pues como en unas 1000 mesas de la gente que pueda ser útil, que les llegue del mundo académico, del Parlamento Europeo, de los parlamentos nacionales, de las comisiones de exteriores, de las universidades, think tanks, etcétera. Y yo les suelo decir, oye, si tienes en un momento dado a alguien pues del Parlamento Europeo o de quien sea, pues de escribir, bueno, ella viene de Malta, pues eso, sobre Malta, pues mírate en el anuario, porque seguro que verás un artículo razonablemente extenso, pero razonablemente corto, para que en un cuarto de hora pues te pongas al día, si no has visto cosas recientemente, de cómo están las cosas en Malta y cómo va, yo qué sé, pues el conflicto de Chipre, que ya casi de tan congelado que lo tenemos nos estamos olvidando de él. Pero bueno, pues aquí encontrarás una actualización razonablemente corta, y esa es una de las ventajas del anuario, y todavía más pues en Afkar, que tiene un estilo, como sabéis, pues más periodístico, pero que está escrito por especialistas, no por periodistas generalistas, sino podrán ser del mundo académico o periodistas especializados en una zona y que pues colaboran con nosotros. Y como sabéis, Afkar lo publicamos coeditándolo junto con Política Exterior, donde hemos, pues en fin, con gran pues sentimiento, pues el codirector por parte de Política Exterior, que era Josep Piqué, en estos últimos 2 o 3 años, pues en fin, nos ha dejado, como sabéis, el exministro Piqué hace unas cuantas semanas, vamos, un par de meses. Bueno, y con ello, hecho el minuto de propaganda, vamos a la sesión sustancial de hoy. Ya sabéis que es las relaciones euromediterráneas en el conflicto israelo-palestino. Obviamente es un tema bastante más de actualidad de lo que desearíamos en estos momentos, y que va a tener, por tanto, distintos enfoques. Yo deduzco que Anna Khakee es bastante europeísta en su contenido académico, y en cambio Isaías y Carmen son bastante más arabistas en su contenido académico, con lo cual tenemos ahí, yo creo, una buena complementariedad, porque en cambio tanto unos como otros pues conocen a fondo la temática, con lo cual tenemos que Anna Khakee va a hacer su intervención inicial y luego pues vamos a tener los comentarios por Carmen, por Isaías o por cualesquiera de vosotros que queráis pues intervenir y criticar y tal, ¿no? La intervención de Anna Khakee va a ser en inglés, con lo cual tenéis audífonos, los que queráis oírlo en audífono, y desde aquí pues yo iré mezclándolo un poco, pero como antes empecé con vosotros en castellano, he seguido en castellano. Bueno, ya hablé antes un poquito de cómo veo la situación, que significa que lo veo bastante mal y que va a peor, y que hace falta que desde el mundo académico pues intentemos introducir un mínimo de racionalidad, al menos en aquello que está un poco más a nuestro alcance, y que es contrarrestar la irracionalidad que se impone muchas veces cuando está en marcha pues un conflicto, por otra parte tan divisivo como es este, donde pues la gente se siente especialmente confrontada. Y ya decía antes, y no voy a insistir mucho más en ello, que yo creo que estamos además en un punto absolutamente clave, no solo por lo que está sucediendo en la zona, que ya es muchísimo y gravísimo, sino porque la respuesta sobreproporcionada hasta un extremo indecible de un acto terrorista inicial nos puede llevar a repetir los errores que se hicieron a partir del 2001, cuando el primer acto terrorista, las Torres Gemelas, pues nos llevó a una espiral increíble de terrorismo internacional, la guerra en Afganistán, guerra en Irak, etcétera, y hasta nuestros días con las de Siria, Libia, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? En realidad, gran parte de eso corresponde a la respuesta exageradísima que se dio a un primer acto terrorista que, bueno, pues el terrorismo en principio se combate con las fuerzas de seguridad, no con fuerza directamente militar, sobre todo cuando se pasó, como es notorio, a la invasión de Irak fuera del contexto de la ONU, etcétera, etcétera, las excusas falsas de las armas famosas por no existentes de destrucción masiva, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que estamos ahora en un punto crucial en el que, y no es que vaya a presumir de ser muy izquierdista, porque estas mismas palabras afortunadamente las ha dicho incluso el propio presidente Biden de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Que les ha advertido de que se puede repetir el error del 2001, y está claro a lo que se estaba refiriendo Biden cuando advirtió a los israelíes de que se podía repetir el error de 2001. Vamos, de las secuencias posteriores de 2001. Bueno, no voy a... I'm not going to take more time because it's your time, in fact, so I will not abuse of that. And, well, we will hear before the Professor Anna Khakee, who's Professor of International Relations, University of Malta. I have here her CV. She's been almost everywhere, mainly in Geneva at the University Institute for Higher International Studies, and then at the University of Malta, but she's been working as well in some important organizations as Amnesty International, the Norwegian Peace Building Center, the UNDP of the United Nations Program for Development. She's been invited professor at Uppsala, at Lisbon, Marseille, and College of Europe, among other places. And most importantly, she is one of the contributors to one of the last issues of Afghan Ideas. That's to bear in mind as a specific interesting point, where she's dealing with, well, remainings of colonialism in current day thinking about Euro-Mediterranean relations and in the Arab world. And so, okay, so Anna, we are really pleased to have you with us, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for inviting me here. It's a I've been asked to talk about Euro-Med relations in the context of the recent flaring up of the conflict, the long-standing conflict in Israeli-Palestinian relations, and it's obviously a daunting task. It's a daunting task on a personal level because it actually takes me out of my comfort zone. I'm not a specialist on Israel-Palestine. The organizers entrusted me with speaking on this topic, so I will try not to disappoint them. But much more importantly, it's a daunting task because the current war is another Zeitenwende, to use an expression that Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, used after the start of the Ukraine war. So it again turns a page in time, or in hindsight, it might become to be seen as part of a broader Zeitenwende, the ushering in of a new era. It's happening at a time when truly and really we should be focusing on the existential menace which is before us and that is so harshly felt in the Mediterranean. The rising temperatures that are threatening our forests, that are threatening our plains, and that are threatening our Mediterranean Sea as we know it. That challenge at least should have some faint potential to unite across the Mediterranean. The Israel-Palestinian conflict does not. It's already further deepening already deeply divided politics and broken dialogue. We see it in statements, for instance, by Ursula von der Leyen, of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, by Emmanuel Macron in his first weeks, and by Arab ambassadors to the European institutions. The UN General Assembly resolution of the 27th of October that was calling for a humanitarian truce in the fighting was led by Jordan, and it was actively supported by a number of southern Mediterranean states, including Egypt, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, and Turkey. But it was not supported at all to the same extent on the northern shore of the Mediterranean. In fact, European states, in a larger proportion than any other region of the world, either abstained or voted against this calling for a humanitarian truce. So as has been clear for some time now, even before this conflict started, there is a worrying tendency towards further retrenchment into antagonistic blocs, which threatens the foundations of Euro-Med relations. Therefore, in this keynote address, I will take as a given that Euro-Med relations risk further serious deterioration if this war continues and even escalates, and if the European response continues to be as disjointed and manifesting such a cacophony as it has been to date. So instead, what I want to do is I want to toy with the idea of a potential political way forward that Europe could take and that could hold promise to ease at least a little bit some of these divisions. I want to argue for European neutrality in this conflict. So a neutral European stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Neutrality has a complex reputation in international relations, historically and at present. In the worst case, it can be seen as moral failure, a lack of courage, a lack of willingness to take a stance for what is right, a lack of willingness to sacrifice, and even a propensity to take advantage, not least economically. It can also be seen as a way to avoid taking sides or a position on an issue that is domestically divisive, so then neutrality is the easy way out. Or it's simply a way of washing your hands of a problem and saying, this is not my problem, this is not my business. Neutrality, moreover, is usually the stuff of small states, the Irelands, the Finlands, the Swedens, and the Switzerlands, the Austrians, and the Maltas in Europe, at least until recently. or it's a solution that is used by states which are not technically small according to standard definitions in international politics, but lack power nevertheless because of their position in the international system. So neutrality was the purported stance of Mediterranean countries such as Egypt, Algeria, and Morocco during the Cold War, when they were part of the non-aligned movement, or it has been the position of many countries in the global south on the Ukraine war, saying this is not our war, we want to remain neutral. So why would I propose that a major power such as the EU should remain neutral in this terrible conflict? Why should Europe remain neutral here when it has taken such a bold and decisive stance on Ukraine? Would it not be condoning the worst sort of abuses if Europe chooses this path? We've heard this from both sides. So I start with a quote from Sandrine Boudana. She's a professor and head of Department of Communications at the University of Tel Aviv. And she wrote in Le Monde on the 25th of October, and I should warn you that this is my translation, but I did my best. The absolute evil is an open evil that does not hide. It is up to us to listen and take our responsibilities. The sinister Islamist ideology makes this promise to Christians. After Saturday comes Sunday. Then I want to juxtapose that with another quote by the Palestinian ambassador to the EU institutions. He writes, also more or less on the same date in the EU Observer, "The role of the European Union is crucial. I implore its leaders and citizens, do not ignore our pleas. Join us in our pursuit of justice and lasting peace." So this is Ambassador Abdelrahim Al-Farah. So both sides of this conflict have made strong efforts at creating a binary. We've heard many such binaries being bandied about during the last month of this conflict. Justice versus injustice, light versus darkness, terrorism versus the right to unthreatened sovereign statehood, victims versus perpetrators, and the ultimate one, good versus evil. But to cite Barack Obama, who was interviewed about the war in a recent podcast, nobody's hands are clean, quote unquote, in this conflict. 50 Shades of Grey has become an equivocal expression, and when I want to use it in class, I always bite my tongue. So let me say that it's a multi-layered conflict comprising many gray tones. Avoiding simplistic binaries is in fact one of several reasons why neutrality might just be what is needed in the current conflict. Before presenting other reasons, I first need to clarify. It's a particular kind of neutrality that I have in mind, so something that is usually labeled active neutrality. So not looking at a kind of three little monkeys kind of neutrality of hearing no evil, seeing no evil, and speaking no evil. It's not about avoiding the moral reckoning which the images that we see before us are now forcing on us. It's a neutrality as in actively pushing for, in a balanced, equitable, and yet forceful manner, for the respect of existing international rules, laws, and frameworks. So it's not a neutrality of remaining on the sidelines, as I mentioned earlier, but a neutrality of relentlessly, and each and every time there is a fear that international law has been broken, to react to that. It's about relying on the self-proclaimed values upon which the European Union was founded, and that would form the bedrock of a more deliberate, thought-through response. Respect for international law, equality, democracy, human rights, moderation, and peaceful coexistence. So concretely, this implies reacting to every single instance where serious breaches of international humanitarian and human rights law can be presumed, such as indiscriminate bombings, hostage-taking, killings, blockades, etc., in a consistent and uniform manner, both in the strength of reaction and in the words and the terminology chosen. We have all heard some dangerous, dehumanizing language which has been used in the last few weeks, such as calling Palestinians human animals, as the Israeli Minister of Defense did on the 9th of October, or calling for the killing of Jewish people or for them to be pushed into the Mediterranean Sea. All such atrocities are equally unacceptable, and Europe must again stand up, again, in a consistent manner, reacting just as forcefully to all such hate speech. There's no definition in international law or in international relations of what terrorism is. It's not defined in international law. However, obviously, atrocious killings of children, of babies, of women, of the elderly, and of civilians more broadly, as happened in Israel on the 7th of October by Hamas, were, by any definition, acts of terrorism. They targeted civilians to instill terror as a step to advance political aims. I just said that international law does not define terrorism, but that doesn't mean that terrorism is not mentioned. So if we look at the 4th Geneva Convention, the one of the Geneva Conventions that deals with the protection of civilians, Article 33 of the 4th Geneva Convention states that collective penalties and likewise all measures of intimidation or of terrorism are prohibited. Now, this convention regulates interstate warfare, except for the common Article 3. But this was Article 33. That means that this paragraph means that regular armed forces can also commit acts of terror. So although we tend to assume that terror and terrorism are committed only by non-state actors, they can quite logically also be committed by state actors, because they can target civilians, not for military goals, but to instill terror in the civilians to achieve political aims. So when the EU institutions use the word terror and terrorism, if they want to be neutral and follow a kind of active neutral approach, they should be measured, consistent, and balanced. And they should, needless to say, avoid conflating those that commit acts that can be defined as terrorist with the entire group of people, be they Israelis or Palestinians. Similarly, any future proposals for mediation should be viewed as equilibriate, with a willingness on the EU side to balance any future team of mediators so that it combines personalities that are seen as pro-Palestinian with those that are seen as more pro-Israeli, or better still, find people who are not committed to either side. Finally, Europe, if it wants to pursue active neutrality, should object to any proposed solution that does not propose or ascertain equal rights to both sides in terms, again, of international law. So that's in a nutshell what active neutrality would mean in the context of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. So let me now try to make a case for this type of neutrality before hopefully preempting some of your objections. The advantages, to my mind, would be the following. If this type of neutrality is well explained and executed, it would hopefully have the advantage of dampening some of the dangerous internal divisions that we're currently seeing within European states. The most serious manifestation of these internal divisions is that we've seen an increase in hate crimes on both sides. So according to one source that I consulted, the recorded anti-Semitic incidents since the 7th of October up until last week was 1,100 incidents in France, over 1,000 in Britain, a 240% increase in such incidents in Germany, and obviously these figures increase by the day. Similarly, Islamophobic incidents are also increasing. So according to the Metropolitan Police, the London Metropolitan Police, there was 101 Islamophobic criminal offences. So obviously that's a more serious form of offence in London in the first 18 days of October, and that was up from 42 during the same period of last year. I'm using this figure from a non-EU country because other countries have not yet published data on Islamophobic incidents in the aftermath of these attacks and the beginning of this war. So we remain in the dark as to the extent of the increase of Islamophobic incidents, but the media seems to be unanimous that there is such an increase as well. So neutrality might lower the temperature by signaling that states will not take sides among its citizens and inhabitants. Tackling this surge in attacks based on religion is obviously very important for cohesion and security in Europe. It's not going to lead to a solution to the conflict itself. It might contribute to easing somewhat the tensions across the Mediterranean, in Euro-Mediterranean relations, because they tend to intensify when minorities in Europe are threatened in this way. But overall, I will grant that this is a mainly Eurocentric argument. A second, also Eurocentric argument, is that it would probably reflect public opinion in Europe rather well. According to a YouGov poll from July of this year, so quite a recent poll, fewer than half of people in each European country that was polled picked sides in this conflict. Instead, a majority in the European countries that were surveyed said either that they didn't know or who they sympathize with, or said that they sympathize equally with both sides. Also, a majority in the European countries included did not find that the conflict mattered that much to them. So there is an even-handedness in public opinion here, which might obviously have reduced in the last few weeks, but at the basis there is an even-handedness in the public opinion here in Europe that is quite compatible with a neutral stance at the European level. Again, it's a very Eurocentric argument, and I will come with a third Eurocentric argument, if you will allow me, and then move on to others as well. It's actually possibly the only position that European governments could live with. It could therefore help to restore some of the unity that was lost in the cacophony of the last weekend that the President was talking about in the introduction to this talk. We did not see European leaders in public fistfights, but it wasn't that far off. The public disunity that was on display between European personalities led the European Parliament to insist in a resolution on the 19th of October that the Commission and the Council, and I quote, must address the situation in a coordinated manner and with one voice to enable the EU to live up to its geopolitical ambitions. In the UN General Assembly resolution of the 27th of October that I mentioned earlier in my talk, no other continent was as divided as the European continent. And this is, although no other continent tries in any way remotely the same way to coordinate its foreign policy in the way that Europeans try. So 8 member states of the European Union voted in favor of the resolution that was sponsored by Jordan and demanding a humanitarian truce. That was Belgium, France, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, Portugal, Slovenia, and Spain. 5 voted against: Austria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Romania. And the remaining countries abstained. The Czech defense minister was so upset by the result, which was in favor of the truce, that she stated that her country should leave the United Nations after the vote because it, quote unquote, has no business in an organization that cheers on terrorists, which obviously incidentally means that she implies that Spain, that Malta, that France are cheerleaders of terrorism. So it hasn't been a physical fist fight, but the leaders of European countries have not really pulled any punches against each other. So they have really been fighting. So neutrality based on international law and the EU treaties just might be something that EU states could accept, if I'm being optimistic, if only out of self-preservation and the preservation of the EU. Historically, and now finally I'm moving out from the Eurocentric arguments, neutrality chimes well with the honest broker role that the EU has tried to adopt, with relatively little success on the ground, it must be said, but within this conflict. So there has been a number of calls among different experts or academics or analysts that Europe should return to this honest broker role. That honest broker role came about even though, or maybe as a consequence of the internal historical and geopolitical divisions within Europe over Israel and Palestine. So if we look historically, the EU's countries have at some key moments managed to speak with one voice on this conflict. Maybe the proudest moment came in 1980, so a long time ago, when there was the Venice Declaration, which led to the recognition of the PLO and to an express support for the Palestinians to self-determination and to an own state. Since then, there was a Madrid conference, but there actually the EU was a minor player. The EU is said and has been mainly an economic actor with a strong set of trade relations with Israel, and it's by far the largest donor to the Palestinian Authority. This primarily economic involvement has led observers to quip that EU is a payer but not a player in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The EU also supported the Oslo Accords in 1993, and in 1999 the Berlin Declaration reiterated a call for a two-state solution, but this time articulating that that kind of a solution should be based on the borders of pre-1967. And it stated that, and I quote, "The EU is convinced that the creation of a democratic, viable, and peaceful sovereign Palestinian state would be the best guarantee of Israel's security." The EU, together with the UN, the US, and the Russian Federation, is also part of the quartet, which was set up in 2002 in the context of the Second Intifada. And finally, the EU maintains, until this day, an EU special representative for the Middle East peace process, which is supposed to work for a two-state solution in accordance with what I just said earlier. So, neutrality could work well with this kind of honest broker role, which has been the one of the EU in the past. Going back much further in time, a neutral stance balances the historical injustices and atrocities committed by Europeans towards European Jewish people during and well before the Holocaust, and also those that were committed against Palestinians and other Arabs during colonialism. So let me explain myself a bit more on this point. As we know all too well, Jewish people were persecuted, murdered, forced to convert, changed from their homes and their homelands over many centuries in many parts of Europe. Here in Spain, an effort to right that terrible wrong came in 2015 when there was an act instituted that grants Spanish citizenship to Sephardic Jews who are descendant of those expelled from Spain in the 15th century. Had I been given this lecture somewhere else in Europe, for example in my home country Sweden, I could have given other example of the relentless persecution of Jewish people just for being Jewish. So it's a stain that doesn't and shouldn't go away. So put differently, the persecution of Jewish people spans the continent. It unites many European countries historically in a terrible and terrifying way. If we look at the mistreatment of Arabs, it has historically taken place outside of Europe, in their own lands. I'm not a historian, as many of you are, so I do not want to try to usurp your field. But we know of the widespread atrocities committed by France in Algeria during colonialism and also during the War of Independence. Italian scholars are increasingly contesting the myth of Italiani brava gente and describing how Italian colonial actions in Libya, not least, may have amounted to genocide. In particular in the eastern part of the country, where there were a lot of camps, and a large part of the Libyan population at the time perished. So just as the global Jewish community has an acute sense of historic vulnerability, the Arab community also has historic memories of extreme persecution. A neutral stance could be a way for Europe to accept responsibility for its history in a holistic way. It's a way of saying we have quite a bit to atone for, and we do not weigh the suffering of our victims, but recognize them all. So never again means never, never, ever again for the Holocaust and for colonial crimes. And this just might ease Euromed relations a bit. Let's face it, neutrality will probably not make either side happy, as it would dash hopes for Europe being on our side, whichever side that might be on. But it would not maybe either make either side extremely unhappy, because public opinion in Europe, as we see it today, is volatile. And Israelis and Palestinians alike know that the position of individual European states are shifting. Neutrality could hopefully ensure some continuity, some certainty, and some stability in very uncertain and dangerous situations such as this one. At the end of the day, it is a position that, if it is well explained and executed, could perhaps prove acceptable to all. After all, each side has suffered tremendously precisely because of a total disregard of human rights and humanitarian law. Much of today's international framework for human rights and for humanitarian law was created as a result of the Second World War and the atrocities of the Second World War and the crimes that were committed during it. So anchoring active neutrality and in a relentless working for the respect of these frameworks should in principle be in the interest of both parties. Of course, it's an idealistic position. It's certainly not a magic bullet. What is compatible and what is not compatible with neutrality will be intensely contested. An anchor in international law, and especially obviously in international humanitarian law and human rights law, would certainly help, but they are also open to interpretation, as we know, and different understandings. It would doubtless mean that European states would have to revisit, for example, its arms export policies to make certain that none of the weaponry or weapons parts that are exported to Israel is used in its war in Gaza or in the West Bank. Thus, it would, for example, mean that the Dutch government could no longer export, as it reportedly recently did, since the beginning of the fighting, a delivery of parts for Israeli F-35 fighter jets, even though it was known that they would be used in Gaza against the civilian population, and even though its own Ministry of Foreign Affairs lawyers warned against it. It's less likely that European weapons would be diverted to Hamas, given the nature of Hamas's international linkages, but of course that needs to be ascertained as well. An active neutrality would also mean that the EU must further strengthen its regulations on direct and indirect relations with the territories occupied by Israel since 1967, and in particular, obviously, Israeli settlements. which are contrary to international law. It already did so with the 2015 rules entailing that products that come from Israeli settlements on occupied land must be labeled as such across the EU. So it would change relations as we know them, but in a predictable manner, anchored in long-standing international rules and basic EU policies and ideals. As already mentioned, we are in a serious situation indeed. Thinking of new solutions is going to be important to avoid a potentially disastrous outcome and should include us as scholars. European policy making urgently needs to become steadier and more consistent on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for Euromed relations, but also for Europe itself. Neutrality might seem utopian given the current situation of EU policies and not enough given the situation on the ground. But discussing and thinking of new paths, finding new ways, seeing problems from new angles will be necessary. Doing so, we need to anchor ourselves in what we have learned from the last century, that what can bring us back from the brink is basic respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law. In that thinking and that discussion, using both heart and head is going to be crucially important. Thank you.
Bueno, aquí tenemos una propuesta de esta Active Neutrality con sus pros y contras y sus características especiales. Y me quedo con algunas frases de las que has dicho. Neutrality will not make either side happy, but will make no one too unhappy. Yes, but I don't know whether this is a good business for this honest broker, anyway. Pues bueno, vamos a ver. Carmen, ¿tú cómo ves el patio?
Bueno, pues lo primero, muchas gracias por la invitación. Es un placer. Acabo de llegar a Barcelona y ya me veo aquí en la mesa discutiendo pues, uno de los temas que desde luego nos tiene la mente puesta a trabajar, sin duda, desde hace años para los que han trabajado sobre todo el conflicto, pero desde el 7 de octubre especialmente, y con todo lo que ha evolucionado después, y no solamente puesta a trabajar, sino también pues, el corazón encogido por todo lo que está ocurriendo. Respecto a la cuestión que nos plantea Anna, la neutralidad activa, pues yo he estado leyendo sobre Suiza y cómo el país se ha cuestionado a lo largo de los años y sobre todo después de la Guerra Fría, cómo debe ponerse en práctica el concepto de neutralidad activa, o sea, dejar la idea de una neutralidad integral para pasar a una neutralidad activa que implicarse en los conflictos, pero por supuesto no tomando partido en el conflicto bélico, sino en operaciones de paz y como figuras de mediadores o como anfitriones de negociaciones de paz. Y, por ser muy breve, yo me quiero centrar en esta idea de la mediación que se ha planteado Suiza como un elemento crucial de lo que es la neutralidad activa. Y quiero ahí diferenciar la idea del facilitador del mediador. Turquía, por ejemplo, fue facilitador en el conflicto entre Ucrania y Rusia. Pero no mediador en el sentido de poder tener, como ustedes saben, hay diferentes figuras de la mediación, pero yo creo que en este caso la más interesante es la mediación que pueda tener también un cierto papel coercitivo o que pueda imponer, ¿no?, cierta presión a las partes para que cumplan los acuerdos firmados. No era el caso, por eso pongo el ejemplo de Turquía como facilitador, que tuvo éxito, por ejemplo, en la cuestión del grano, por ejemplo, para poder transportar el grano desde los puertos ucranianos a otros lugares del mundo, y otros ejemplos de negociación que llevó a cabo, como digo, con éxito entre Ucrania y Rusia. Y aquí, por eso me planteo, ¿puede ser la Unión Europea solo un facilitador, teniendo en cuenta que yo llevo trabajando en la Unión Europea desde mi tesis doctoral. Una de las cosas, características que ha definido a las relaciones de la Unión Europea con terceros países e incluso para aceptar en el club de la Unión Europea ha sido el condicionamiento político. ¿Puede la Unión Europea entonces dejar a un lado, ponerse a un margen, ser simplemente una arena sobre la que se produzcan las negociaciones y quedarse al margen si no se cumplen o si no se llegan a acuerdos entre las partes? Yo creo que en la esencia de la Unión Europea estaría apoyar y promover ese condicionamiento democrático, ¿no? Y luego, una última cosa, por no alargarme, la cuestión de la credibilidad. Para ser una figura que digamos, lleve a cabo su papel con éxito en el ámbito de la neutralidad activa y en el ámbito de la mediación, tienes que ser un actor creíble. Y, sin duda, ha sido devastador para la Unión Europea y para su imagen en el exterior, como estamos viendo si seguimos los medios del otro lado, dentro también de esta orilla del Mediterráneo, pero si nos vamos a la otra orilla del Mediterráneo, está clarísima cómo la imagen de la Unión Europea y la imagen de Estados Unidos se han visto dañadas enormemente por la posición que han tomado en el conflicto, y ya no solo por la posición, sino por una narrativa que nos ha dejado helados, muy especialmente cuando tenemos tan frescas en la memoria las frases que se han dicho sobre el conflicto de Ucrania. Esto hace que sí, y ojalá quisiera la Unión Europea llevar a cabo ese papel de mediación y de mediación activa, pero para eso tendrá que, desde luego, reformar lo primero la narrativa y ajustarla a lo que está ocurriendo en el terreno. No puede ser que nosotros veamos unas cosas y luego los políticos nos cuentan que pasen otras. Es una desconexión impresionante con la realidad y, desde luego, con los que estamos siguiendo este conflicto. Y, por lo tanto, yo veo muy difícil que la Unión Europea rompa esta inercia en la que está ahora envuelta y, como digo, empiece a cambiar ya no los hechos, sino la narrativa sobre los hechos. Y vemos que algunos países, ¿no? Alemania, por ejemplo Francia, hasta hace poco, tienen un discurso que en esta cuestión que está muy influido, desde luego, por este sentido de la culpabilidad de lo que ocurrió en la Segunda Guerra Mundial y del papel de determinados gobiernos y países en el Holocausto. Pero aquí retomo algunos argumentarios que me han parecido muy interesantes, que hemos podido leer estos días. La Unión Europea tiene que dejar atrás esta idea de la culpabilidad. La culpabilidad es un sentimiento defensivo que busca la redención. No tenemos, lo siento, no busquen nuestro perdón, lo hecho, hecho está. Que la Unión Europea asuma su responsabilidad, que es lo que tiene que hacer, y que tome papeles ante lo que está ocurriendo, que pues todos sabemos, ¿no? Tenemos la palabra en la cabeza. Y bueno, yo estoy deseando, ya es que me voy a mojar, pero yo estoy deseando que el Tribunal Penal Internacional empiece a, desde luego, sacar sus sentencias y empiece a dejar negro sobre blanco los crímenes de guerra que se están cometiendo y podamos dejar de escuchar a Olaf Scholz diciendo que Israel se está cumpliendo, bueno, pues el derecho internacional. Y esperemos que, desde luego, Hamás y los miembros de Hamás que cometieron a cabo los actos terroristas sean juzgados como debe hacerse en países civilizados, con pruebas y con juicios, y, desde luego, que se acabe este acoso a la población civil, que es uno de los momentos más tremendos, desde luego, del momento histórico que nos ha tocado vivir.
Isaías, your turn.
Yo también intervendré en español. Os ahorro mi inglés acartonado y con acento francés. Muchas gracias, Ana. La intervención creo que da para mucho debate, ¿no? Y se espera que los discusan, ¿no? Pues provoquemos, cuestionemos, metamos algunas cuñitas, ¿no? en algunas cosas, ¿no? Así que espero que seas benévola con mis comentarios. Bien, estamos en un país donde el término neutralidad activa tiene un sentido determinado. En España se utiliza desde hace mucho tiempo el término neutralidad activa para definir la posición española respecto al Sáhara Occidental. Y eso a nosotros nos coloca ya de entrada. ¿Y cuándo se empezó a utilizar este término? En el franquismo sin Franco, es decir, exactamente en el momento en que España salió, y para no tener que dar explicaciones, ¿no?, se empezó a utilizar ese término. Y los gobiernos de la transición ya democrática lo resignificaron. Lo resignificaron porque interesaba mantener unas relaciones estrechas con los vecinos inmediatos, con Marruecos y Argelia, hacer equilibrios, pero sobre todo, poner por delante los intereses duros, ¿no?, y posponer las cuestiones que tenían que ver con la responsabilidad de la descolonización fallida, etcétera. Es decir, el término aquí, por lo menos en España, ¿no?, de neutralidad activa ha servido de trampantojo o de pantalla para no asumir, digamos, una posición coherente, ¿no?, ante una cuestión, digamos, que tocaba directamente a la historia reciente de España. Es decir, es un término que se ha utilizado para hacer primar la realpolitik, ¿no?, sobre las cuestiones de derecho. Obviamente podemos darle otro significado y yo creo que le has dado contenido, ¿no? Has intentado, bueno, pues ajustar esto, pero inmediatamente oímos esa palabra, para nosotros tiene un significado determinado, ¿no? Pero señala la posibilidad de que sea precisamente algo, digamos, que sirva de pantalla para no mojarse, para no responsabilizarse, ¿no? Y esa es la... Bien, mi segundo comentario. Claro, esto se da en un momento... Me interesó mucho lo de los 3 argumentos eurocéntricos, ¿no? Porque se da en un momento, después de al menos una década, en el que Europa se ha estado mirando a sí misma. Durante mucho tiempo, las preocupaciones son actuales: definirse como actor geopolítico, es la autonomía estratégica, es el nearshoring, todo eso, y no se dice claramente cómo afecta a los vecinos del sur, no se les pregunta cómo encajan ahí, ¿no? Al final, no sé si esto, en cierta forma, no refuerza una tendencia, y es que Europa concibe y diseña su relación con los vecinos sin consultar a los vecinos, ¿no? Es decir, esto me viene bien, estos son mis intereses, esto es mi forma de recolocarme en el mundo, etcétera. Y por lo tanto, ante una patata caliente, ¿no?, bueno, pues lo de la neutralidad activa puede encajar perfectamente en esa despolitización, ¿no? Despolitización. Y eso a mí me lleva a pensar un poco que puede reconfortar ese tipo de relaciones, no solamente Euromed, sino que permea toda la acción exterior de la Unión Europea, que es cada vez más despolitizada y más tecnocrática, lo han comentado antes en las mesas anteriores, que en cierta forma es la proyección de la forma de funcionar de la Unión Europea en su acción exterior, porque hacia adentro también es así. Es decir, cuando los temas son complejos, respuesta tecnocrática y despolitización, ¿no? Entonces, no sé en qué medida esto no en cierta forma encaja bien y, digamos, sirve un poco para consolidar una aproximación que es cuestionable, ¿no? Bien, tercer comentario. ¿Podemos realmente hablar de neutralidad cuando estamos ante un problema que no es solamente de paz y seguridad, es un problema colonial? Es un problema colonial. Israel es hija de Europa. Y eso ha quedado en evidencia en la respuesta de los Estados. La primera respuesta de los Estados: estoy con Israel porque es de los míos. Porque es de los míos. Más allá de si hay argumentos de derecho, etc. En cierta forma, porque es Occidente. Es una cuña occidental en Europa, ¿no? Y no solo eso, es que Europa, en cierta forma, ha sido corresponsable de la situación de, digamos, de impunidad con la que se ha movido Israel durante mucho tiempo, consintiéndole, digamos, que no actúe como un actor normal en la escena internacional. Se le ha consentido excepciones, se le ha consentido la anomalía de una ocupación que dura 56 años, se le ha aceptado, no voy a entrar en detalles, pero es un cúmulo enorme, ¿no? En Naciones Unidas, bueno, pues hemos visto hasta dónde ha llegado, ¿no? Por lo tanto, me cuesta imaginar una forma de abordar una neutralidad activa tal como la defines, en el que la simetría es tan importante, ¿no? Y las responsabilidades de la Unión Europea son tan consustanciales, ¿no?, a la situación, que esto es una especie como de deserción, ¿no? O sea, es una especie de lavarse de nuevo las manos, ¿no?, ante lo que está ocurriendo. Mi conclusión es que yo creo que para construir unas relaciones de vecindario realmente constructivas, con futuro, con todas las dimensiones, no solamente políticas, económicas, sino fundamentalmente humanas, etcétera, lo que necesitamos quizás, más que la neutralidad activa, es la coherencia activa. Gracias.
Muy bien. You may answer now, or we take some other questions. Maybe you can answer now rather shortly, because we can.
Yes.
You can continue with the same arguments when we pick some other questions from the public.
Okay, thanks a lot. It's very interesting how active neutrality, and this is a very good example of how concepts don't travel in Europe. Because I come from Sweden, so active neutrality from my perspective means something completely different. If you look at the Swedish conception of neutrality during the Cold War, it was not commensurate with the Spanish position on Western Sahara, and it was not Swiss-style neutrality. It was two opposing ways of looking at neutrality. So Switzerland, I've lived a long time in Switzerland, is almost like it's just there. It says, we're a forum. If you want to use our services, we will be there. That's not the kind of neutrality that I was thinking about, and it's not what I had in mind when I was defining active neutrality, but obviously there are different conceptions. So yes, lost in European translation, I think. Yes, neutrality must be credible, because neutrality is all about credibility, in fact, and Europe has lost a lot of credibility already. But Europe, whatever solution it chooses, it will have a big problem with regaining credibility. If it chooses one line or another line, it has lost a lot of time, and by squabbling and by disagreeing. So yes, so when I mean active neutrality, I really do not mean depoliticization or more technocratic relations. It's actually, if you think that really standing up for human rights law or humanitarian law and laws of war, if that is depoliticization, then I agree. Yes, then that's what I mean. But that's not what we often think about, and that's not what the EU would have to do in order to defend human rights law and humanitarian law. It would actually have to not wash its hands of the problem, but it would have to consistently say, you can't bomb a hospital, because it goes against international humanitarian law. Full stop. So when I say in each and every instance, that's actually what I mean, that in each and every instance, if the Europeans want to be credible, they will have to react. So it's not depoliticized the way I see it, or technocratic. On the colonial side, I think it's so complicated, because Israel is the creation of the West, yes, and it was a way of the West, or Europe, to wash itself of a problem of its own creation during the Second World War. But the Israelis had suffered, or the Jewish people had suffered tremendously in Europe over centuries. So there is that, which is that historic guilt, and so we have these different issues that Europe is still grappling with, and not really. And we see the differences between European countries. So we see the Czech Republic, which only sees, or mainly sees, the Israeli narrative and the victimhood of the Jewish people historically. And then we have other countries that will see, such as Malta, for instance, that will more emphasize the victimhood of the Palestinians.
Vamos a abrir un turno de preguntas, intervenciones, lo que sea. Yo creo que aquí, claro, nos enfrentamos a un tema en que hay, por un lado, la natural, digamos, reacción de exigencia ética, y por el otro lado, la misaré, no hace falta que estés así, y tardo poco. Y por el otro lado, pues, llamémosle en el sentido, si es que lo tiene positivo, el cálculo político para conseguir, aunque sea en este caso, pues poder ayudar más a la paz. Entonces ahí yo creo que hay argumentos en favor o en contra, ¿no? Si uno pierde la neutralidad, pierde la opción a intentar ayudar a la paz, salvo que seas tan fuerte que la impongas. Pero como ese no va a ser el caso de Europa, eso es un argumento en favor de mantener una cierta neutralidad activa, en el sentido de que, oiga, yo soy neutral en el sentido de que no intervengo militarmente en la guerra, pero obviamente voy a denunciar las violaciones de derecho internacional humanitario y todas las que haga falta aquí y en el Tribunal Internacional y donde haga falta. O sea que es que creo que ahí hay quizá neutralidad es una palabra que es demasiado, como dirían los lingüistas, polisémica, ¿no? Y que es tan susceptible de distintas interpretaciones que yo no sé si es que es utilizable en algún sentido clarificador. Pero, en fin, bien, vamos a abrir aquí. A ver, primero han pedido... Sí, venga, adelante. Espera, tenemos un micro para que te oigamos todos mejor.
Me vas a perdonar porque ni el español ni el inglés son mi idioma nativo, pero vengo de un país donde...
You may go in English. You want.
Okay, so I come from a country where neutrality has a very...
Which country?
Portugal.
Portugal.
That means that back in the 1940s, we allowed the Americans and the Allies to station at a base, and at the same time, we filled our coffers with Nazi gold. So basically, I'm a bit confused by this concept of active neutrality, but I can see where you come from in this last explanation. But what I really wanted to ask is, do you think Europe is losing the race, you know, in terms of mediation? Because I have followed some Latin American countries' responses to this, and especially Brazil has been playing a huge role, if not recognized, but a huge role in trying to, you know, get at least everyone together and everyone talking. So that's really my question. Are we really losing the race, so to speak, to other countries? Is this inevitable? Is this completely expected, since, you know, the response we had from the highest official of the European Union, which is not elected by any of us in this room, nor in any room, is this inevitably? Was it expected? That was really my question. Thank you.
Muy bien. A ver, había una palabra pedida, por favor. Había una palabra pedida allí. Si levantáis la mano, iré...
Hola, muchas gracias. Tampoco soy de España, así si lo podría preguntar en inglés, sería guay. So for me, the concept of neutrality would be a rather new concept within this context, I would say, because Europe or European states have been so present in the creation of this Israeli state and throughout the entire occupation of Israel, that now saying we're all of a sudden neutral somehow in this matter, or however we would define it to get to this point, doesn't seem very credible. And credibility was the main argument for taking this mediative role. So how can we take this mediative role, or how can we get this sense of credibility by all of a sudden claiming to be neutral? And how about we take accountability for the role we have played over the last 75 years for the creation of the State of Israel, as a German for why the Israelis are there in the first place now, and maybe also, I don't know, what would it mean for us now to claim to be neutral again? Wouldn't we repeat the cycle of losing credibility and allowing the crimes that have happened over the last 30 days, for example? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sí. A ver,
Hello, thank you for the intervention.
Just a minute. Luego os daré la oportunidad de responder a Ana y también a vosotros dos. Lo digo por si os sentís inspirados a efecto.
Now, I just wanted to say that I'm actually from Brazil. So my concept of neutrality, I actually resonate a lot to me precisely for the role, I think, President Lula and how he has been referring. So when you were describing, I could only think about how they were positioning, how Brazil and all the diplomat service is positioning itself. So I don't know if you have been following how Brazil has been positioning itself, but I think it's the closest, I don't know, of other countries, but being like medium power is the closest I would think about in terms of this idea of neutrality, but at the same time, it's not the same as European Union in terms of the entire process. So, yeah, I think if Brazil would be a good case, I don't know if you agree. Thank you.
Muy bien. So you have the floor if you want to. There is a question over there. Yeah, venga, pues ala.
¿En inglés o en castellano?
Lo que quieras,
En castellano.
checoslovaco.
No, sobre el concepto de neutralidad, yo aquí le veo dos puntos importantes. Bueno, de alguna manera también ya se ha dicho, pero para perfilarlo un poco mejor, yo no soy trabajo filosofía política, seguro que aquí hay alguna persona que me puede ayudar mejor, pero por lo que conozco, los conceptos de filosofía política, por ejemplo, que you use the term evil, ¿no? Del evil en the total evil, todos estos conceptos a mí y la neutralidad me resuenan a la filosofía política de Arendt. Yo no veo claro de que Arendt diga que ante el total evil la filosofía política se posicione desde esa neutralidad, es todo lo contrario. Entonces, bueno, esto desde este concepto. Y desde un concepto más micro, yo no trabajo tampoco mediación, lo que es, por ejemplo, en todas las situaciones de violencia, cuando hay una violencia extrema, no entra la mediación por el tema de las asimetrías de poder. Entonces no entra, la neutralidad no es posible. Ya está. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Muy bien.
Okay,
Anna.
Thank you so much for those comments and questions. Europe and whether it's losing the race in terms of mediation. Europe was never a mediator. It never was in the race, really and truly. So it's not going to get any closer with the kind of policies that it's pursuing at the moment. So it was always the US primarily that was the negotiator. So I don't see that ideally, yes, Europe should be a mediator, but I'm not even thinking that far, actually. I'm just hoping for a little bit more coherence and a little bit more, at the end of the day, more justice in the European position. Nothing more. So I don't think that Europe will be the preferred negotiator of either side, to be honest. It was never the preferred negotiator of Israel. because the US is a stronger friend, quote unquote, of Israel. So yes, I think that race has been lost. Neutrality as how can neutrality be made as a credible concept? As I tried to explain in the presentation, but I probably went a bit too fast. When Europe tried to act as an honest broker, which it has done on in several instances, it actually tried to be more neutral. There were times when it was more championing Palestinian rights, and that's why Israel doesn't prefer it as its favorite broker. So neutrality in that sense is not as far-fetched as it might seem when we listen to what Macron or the German Minister of Foreign Affairs says now. So there is a history which maybe gives a little bit more hope. I must look at what Brazil has been doing. I've been following what Brazil did in the Ukraine conflict, where it refused to be drawn in. But was criticized as well for its statement, but I haven't actually followed what Brazil has been saying about Israel, so I will for sure read up on that. The good and evil, I think, probably it got lost in translation because it was about what the binaries that are being used by the parties to the conflict, not what I am saying that neutrality is about. Again, mediation is not really in the cards for the European Union. Unfortunately, I don't think that Europe is going to be a mediator. So, yeah, unfortunately.
Me gustaría añadir muy brevemente. Yo estoy de acuerdo con Ana cuando decía que o sea, ya sería deseable, efectivamente, que la Unión Europea tuviera este papel de defensa del derecho internacional para todas las partes, y lo quería relacionar también con lo que nos ha contado Senena al principio, es decir, la idea de la racionalidad, que eso es algo, para mí desde luego es una de las cosas que más me ha sacado de mis casillas, aparte del... Ya estoy calmada, pero aparte desde luego de la catástrofe humanitaria a la que estamos asistiendo en Gaza. O sea, es la falta de racionalidad en el discurso de los políticos europeos, ¿no? Esa falta de ser capaces de contar efectivamente lo que está pasando. Y eso ha sido, de verdad, yo creo que nos ha dejado realmente descolocados, porque hay mucho que hacer y vemos que la narrativa para poder, desde luego, hacer frente a una realidad de un problema, lo importante es hacer un diagnóstico correcto del problema, pero la narrativa está tan atrás e incluso tan anquilosada en algunos actores que parece muy difícil que efectivamente, lo que decía Ana, que para mí desde luego ya sería el primer paso deseable, es que pudiéramos afrontar la realidad de los hechos como están ocurriendo, tener posturas coherentes y desde luego defender el derecho internacional humanitario.
Bueno, yo como tengo esa tendencia a estar en favor de los pobres y desfavorecidos y esas cosas que nos entran, a los que nos hemos dedicado especialmente a temas de cooperación al desarrollo y esas cosas, me voy a poner al lado de la minoría, porque yo creo que Ana está más bien en minoría aquí. Y Europa, el problema que tiene es que no va a poder tomar parte en ningún sentido porque está dividida internamente. Con lo cual, pedir que la Unión Europea como tal, tome partido, no lo podrá hacer, porque dentro habrá países que tengan opiniones distintas. Con lo cual, lo que podemos conseguir es que, diciendo que somos neutrales, en ese sentido, yo no sé cómo habrá que llamarlo, si las palabras no indican suficientemente los hechos, pero neutralidad activa no me parece tan mala, aunque aquí pueda tener otras consonancias relativo al tema del Sáhara en su momento, ¿no? Pero a lo que podemos aspirar es a que, diciendo que somos neutrales en el conflicto, poder reclamar el cumplimiento del derecho internacional, acusar a los culpables, etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. porque eso sí lo podemos hacer, porque a eso no se podrá oponer nadie dentro de Europa, creo yo, o en todo caso se podrán oponer mucho menos, o cuando se opongan quedarán mucho más en evidencia. Porque pedir que Europa tome un partido es que eso no podrá suceder. Con lo cual, en fin, yo me pongo al lado de ella. Ya sé que hay que buscar la manera de explicarlo. Yo creo que Ana peca de excesivamente académica y que el lenguaje, digamos, para el político, que es de lo que estábamos hablando, de que tienen que actualizar su narrativa, etcétera, etcétera, tiene que intentar no solo transmitir sus ideas de una manera coherente, que también, pero también llegar un poco al corazón de la gente, ¿no? Y en un sentido positivo. Pero claro, tiene que hacerlo de tal manera que sea factible lo que quiere hacer, porque si para llegar al corazón de la gente lo hace de una manera que se imposibilita para la acción que quiere emprender, pues estará estupendo como predicador, pero como político cero. Con lo cual, venga, Isaías, ataca.
Es cierto. La acción exterior europea hoy solo es posible en mínimos denominadores. Y por lo tanto, cualquier pretensión, digamos, de mucha coherencia o de iniciativa política que cambie un poco el statu quo, etcétera, es inimaginable, ¿no? O inviable. Pero yo dudo de que haya, digamos, una especie como de consenso en torno al derecho internacional humanitario, que no generaría ningún tipo de objeción entre los 27. Veamos casos concretos, ¿no? Hace unos meses, la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas votó una resolución para pedir simplemente un dictamen a la Corte Internacional de Justicia. No estamos hablando ni del Tribunal Penal Internacional, sino a la Corte Internacional de Justicia sobre la responsabilidad de Israel después de 56 años de ocupación. El voto estuvo dividido. Eso era derecho internacional puro, simple. Y además era un dictamen, ni siquiera se estaba activando el capítulo 7 y le iban a utilizar medidas coactivas. Era simplemente utilizar los instrumentos que permiten un poco recordar, porque un dictamen de la Corte Internacional de Justicia es una opinión legal y nada más. Y no hubo ese consenso.
Sí, lo que pasa es que al menos el pedirlo ya es un acto político y ya deja retratado al otro y te permite hacer presión diciendo que eres neutral. En fin, no sé. Ana, puedes en fin, tener tu intervención final diciendo que todos estamos equivocados, o que todos tenemos razón. En fin, hay opiniones de todo tipo, pero a ti te corresponde la palabra final.
Okay. Thank you. I think that there were many different positions. I'm not sure that there is just two or so. So I'm glad I managed to launch a discussion and a lively discussion at that. I think it is more dangerous after Ukraine for Europe not to have some sort of common position. It's looking worse than it did before Ukraine. So that's sort of the basis of my thinking. What could be done? And yes, I'm not saying that active neutrality is going to work, and that it is quite idealistic, because Europe doesn't normally really respect human rights law or international humanitarian law. But at the same time, one has to start from something. And Europe is deeply divided. So it's unclear what is going to happen, but yes, we can probably be quite pessimistic. I don't think that any of the commissioners are going to sort of call me tomorrow to ask me to come and explain what this means.
Bueno, muy bien, yo creo que hemos agotado el tiempo, pero tenemos todavía unas cuantas horas por delante. Durante todo el día de mañana seguro que el tema va a seguir estando presente y que por tanto no hemos agotado aquí el debate. En todo caso, gracias por la participación y seguiremos mañana.
sea que estás muy pesimista también a medio y largo plazo.